All right, diving in again. Today we've got The War on Warriors.
By Pete Hegseth.
Pete Hegseth, of course, Fox News guy these days. But
Army vet.
yeah, 20 years, right?
Yep. Served in Iraq, Afghanistan. Really knows what he's talking about.
So when this guy says the military is facing a war, you got to listen, right?
And he means it. This book's his warning, not about some foreign enemy, but about...
A war from the inside.
Yeah, that's what he calls it, woke ideology. His words. Big threat to the military, he thinks.
It's definitely a strong take.
Controversial, for sure. But that's why we're here, to break it down.
All right, so what's the heart of this war on warriors? Hegseth uses his own story, doesn't he? Kind of sets the stage.
Definitely. The guy gets investigated by the military for extremism, which is...
Pretty wild.
Yeah.
When you think about it. 2 decades serving, then suddenly...
They're questioning his loyalty. It's ironic.
Totally. Like the values he thought he was defending are now...
being used against him.
All right, so let's unpack this. This war he talks about, it's not just about one thing.
No, it's multifaceted.
He points to, like, renaming military bases, the ones named after Confederate figures. Now, on the surface, you might think...
It seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but Hegseth sees it as part of this bigger thing.
Rewriting history, erasing traditional American values, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's deeper than just the names on the bases.
For him, it is. And then there's the whole DEI thing, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, big in a lot of institutions these days.
But Hegseth is worried it's gone too far, that it's less about fairness and more about...
Pushing a political agenda?
Exactly. He sees it as a distraction. The military should be focused on, preparing for actual war, not on...
Social engineering.
That's how he sees it.
And he doesn't hold back on criticizing some pretty high-up military figures.
Yeah, he names names. Like General Mark Milley.
Big name.
Huge. Hegseth criticizes Milley for focusing on things like critical race theory, which in Hegseth's view is just...
divisive.
Right, and has nothing to do with fighting wars. And then there's Bishop Garrison.
Hegseth really goes after him.
Well, Garrison had been pretty vocal in his criticism of Trump and his supporters.
So Hegseth's concern is, can someone with those strong political views really be objective?
Can they really address extremism in the ranks fairly? That's the question Hegseth's raising.
Interesting. It makes you think about the whole purpose of these initiatives. Is it really about tackling extremism?
Or is it more about, purging anyone who doesn't fit a certain mold?
That's a big question.
And Hegseth seems to think it's the latter, that this whole extremism focus is a way to silence conservatives in the military.
He even brings up the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, compares it to The Crucible, that play where people are accused based on nothing and forced to confess. Pretty intense comparison.
It is. And it gets even more complicated when you consider how he thinks the definition of extremism is being used.
It's gotten so broad, according to him.
He actually suggests that just supporting Donald Trump is now considered extreme. Which, if true,
would be pretty concerning. It feeds into his argument that the military is losing sight of its real priorities. And that ties into another big theme in the book, women in combat roles.
Yeah, he's got some strong opinions on that.
Very strong. He's not a fan of the move towards gender integration.
He thinks it's dangerous and impractical, right?
He says there are just fundamental differences between men and women. Physically, biological.
That make it dangerous to have women in combat.
He actually points to a Marine Corps study from 2015, says it proved all male units performed better, but that it got buried because...
didn't fit the narrative.
Exactly. He sees it as another example of politics trumping, military effectiveness.
He's saying they're lowering standards just to make things look good, but it actually weakens the military.
And puts women themselves at risk.
His argument boils down to, the military's one job is to win wars. And if that means different standards,
then so be it.
Now, I'm sure some people would say, hold on, shouldn't the military reflect the society it protects?
And that's where things get even more interesting. He connects all of this to the recruitment crisis.
The military's been struggling to get people to enlist, right?
Big time. Hegseth says that young men, the ones who traditionally join up,
aren't interested anymore.
And he thinks it's partly because of this shift away from traditional masculinity.
Interesting. He's saying the military's become too soft.
Not in those exact words, but yeah. Those old school virtues, courage, strength, stoicism.
Or being replaced.
With, sensitivity and emotional vulnerability, things like that.
And young guys aren't inspired by that.
He thinks they want to be challenged, pushed to their limits.
He even talks about how veterans are portrayed in society now, that whole damaged warrior narrative
He thinks that scares young people off too. It's like the warrior archetype
is being demonized.
instead of celebrated.
So we've got these cultural shifts happening, this attack on traditional masculinity, and then you add in his worries about the military going woke.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
He's saying the military is losing its identity, losing its appeal. And then on top of that, he brings up the military-industrial complex.
Ah, yes. The good old revolving door. Eisenhower warned about it way back when.
He's talking about that close relationship between the government, the military, and all those defense contractors.
Generals becoming lobbyists, companies influencing policy and spending. Hegseth thinks it's a recipe for corruption.
He's worried that wars are being fought for profit, not for the good of the country. It raises some big questions like,
Are we spending too much on defense? Are we fighting the right wars? And who's really benefiting?
heavy stuff. But then the book takes a bit of a turn, right? He starts talking about the lessons he learned from his time in service.
It becomes less about criticism and more about, solutions, both for the military and for individuals.
He talks about courage, discipline, selflessness, perseverance.
He's saying these aren't just military values, they're essential life skills. And he uses stories from his own experience to illustrate them. Really powerful stories, by the way.
I agree. They give you a real sense of what it was like for him, being in those situations, facing danger, overcoming adversity, leading under pressure.
And he connects it all back to everyday life. Maybe you're not in combat, but everyone faces challenges.
Setbacks, disappointments, curveballs. He's saying those moments can either break you or make you stronger.
And the military teaches you how to be strong, how to be resilient.
He also talks about discipline, right? That strict training, attention to detail, following orders even when they don't make sense.
He's saying that translates to civilian life, too. Setting goals, creating structure, holding yourself accountable. He even uses the example of making your bed every morning.
Small thing, but it sets the tone for the day.
Creates a sense of order. And then there's teamwork. Putting the mission ahead of your ego.
Relying on others, trusting them with your life.
Working together towards a common goal, which he contrasts with what he sees as this growing individualism in America.
It's all about me, myself, and I these days. He worries we're losing that sense of community and shared purpose.
And then there's that whole warrior ethos. He's got this almost romantic view of the warrior, the protector, the person who's willing to sacrifice everything. And he thinks that archetype is under attack.
That we're becoming a culture that values safety and comfort above all else.
And he thinks that has real consequences, like the recruitment crisis.
Fewer young people willing to serve, to sacrifice.
Because we've lost sight of what it means to be a warrior. He's not talking about violence, but about courage, selflessness, dedication to something bigger than yourself.
He asks readers, what kind of warrior will you be? And he makes it clear that this warrior spirit, it's not just for the battlefield.
It's about standing up for what you believe in, fighting for what's right, even in everyday life. And then he brings it all back to this idea of the American covenant.
That contract between the people and their government, built on shared values.
And he thinks that covenant's under attack today.
Okay, so that's a lot to digest. We've covered his critique of the woke military, the recruitment crisis, the military-industrial complex, and then this turn towards these life lessons in the American covenant.
It's a lot, but it's all connected. In the next part, we're going to dig into some of the specific examples he uses.
Get into the details of his arguments.
And we'll explore that Gideon analogy a bit more.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue to unpack the war on warriors.
Back again, diving deeper into the war on warriors. We talked about the big arguments, but Hegseth really brings it to life, you know?
Oh, yeah, he's got those personal stories.
And the historical stuff?
Really makes you think. Like that story about his first combat mission in Iraq,
Intense.
leading his platoon, under fire. You can practically feel
chaos.
Yeah, the fear, the adrenaline. He paints such a vivid picture.
And in that moment, all his training kicks in, but he's also got to overcome,
Such doubt, fear. I mean, who wouldn't be scared?
Exactly. But he's got to make decisions. For his men, it's life or death.
Really highlights what courage is.
Right.
It's not about not feeling fear.
It's about pushing through it when it matters most.
When the stakes are high. And that ties into one of the big lessons he talks about, resilience, which he says the military is all about. Building that resilience.
Not just physically.
Mentally, emotionally, you're constantly tested.
To your limits.
Having to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
He connects it to everyday life, too.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, maybe we're not dodging bullets, but
everyone faces setbacks, disappointments.
Stuff happens. And Hegseth's saying those moments, They can break you.
Or they can make you stronger.
In the military, it's like a training ground for that. Learning how to
bend without breaking.
I like that. Then there's discipline. He talks a lot about that too.
The rigorous training.
The attention to detail, following orders, even when you don't.
Understand why.
He's saying that kind of discipline, it pays off in civilian life too.
Setting goals.
Creating structure. Holding yourself accountable.
In your career, relationships, everything. He even uses the example of making your bed every morning.
Simple.
But it sets the tone for the day.
It's like a tiny victory.
But those tiny victories add up. Then there's the whole teamwork thing, putting the mission first.
Ahead of your own ego. He talks about how in the military you have to rely on
your comrades.
Trust them with your life.
Work together even when you
don't always agree.
And he compares that to what he sees as this growing individualism in society.
Like it's all about me now. He's worried we're losing that sense of shared purpose. And then there's that warrior ethos that he keeps coming back to.
He almost romanticizes it, right? That ideal of the warrior.
The protector, the one who sacrifices. He sees that archetype as being under attack now.
Like it's out of fashion.
Replaced with this culture of safety and comfort. And he thinks that shift, it has consequences.
Like the recruitment crisis.
Young people just aren't as interested in serving anymore.
He thinks it's because we've lost sight of what it means to be a warrior.
And he's not talking about being violent or aggressive. It's about those other qualities.
Courage, selflessness, dedication to something bigger than yourself. And he challenges readers,
Asks, what kind of warrior are you going to be? And he's clear that this warrior spirit...
It's not just for soldier.
It's for everyone. It's about standing up for what's right, fighting for your beliefs, even in everyday life. And then he brings it all back to...
the American covenant.
Which is... Remind me.
Well, it's like this contract, right, between the people and their government based on shared values, this idea that we'll defend those values.
Okay, yeah. And Hegseth thinks that covenant is under threat now, which kind of leads into that whole Gideon analogy, right? The biblical story. How does that fit in?
So Gideon, he was this reluctant warrior. God chose him to lead the Israelites against this huge enemy.
Much bigger, more powerful. And Gideon, he's full of doubt, doesn't want to do it.
But he steps up anyway, and against all odds leads them to victory. Hegseth sees a parallel there with America today.
We've become complacent, lost sight of those core values.
Facing all these threats, internal and external, and Hegseth saying, we need to rediscover that courage, that faith, that commitment.
Like a modern-day Gideon, someone to rally the troops, so to speak. Lead us back to this idea of America as a beacon of freedom and strength. But he doesn't shy away from the fact that this is going to take
sacrifice,
putting the nation first, defending our way of life. It's a powerful message, especially for people who feel like America's
losing its way.
Hegseth's book. It definitely speaks to that feeling, that anxiety about where we're headed. It's like he's tapping into this nostalgia for a time when things seemed
simpler.
Values were clear. America was strong. But he's not just looking back.
He's offering a vision for the future.
A way forward. Based on those traditional values, a strong military, and this renewed sense of national unity. Whether you agree with them or not.
It makes you think.
It challenges you to examine your own beliefs about patriotism, about service, about what it means to be a warrior. And in the next part, we'll look at some of the criticisms of his book.
Because there are definitely people who disagree with him.
But even if you don't agree with everything he says, I think there's value
engaging with his ideas.
Trying to understand where he's coming from. Because at the end of the day, it's about
having these conversations,
talking about the issues that matter, and figuring out together how to move forward. Okay, so we've really dug into Hegseth's perspective, but, it got acknowledged.
Then everyone's going to agree.
Right. The war on warriors, it sparked a lot of debate, and for good reason. I mean, some people say he's painting things too.
Black and white.
Yeah, like it's us versus them all the time. But the world's messy. Right. Lots of gray areas.
Definitely. For example, that whole DEI critique. Some folks might say Hegseth's downplaying the problem of
discrimination.
Yeah, which is real. It still happens. So pushing for diversity and inclusion.
It's not a bad thing.
Right. Some would say it's essential for making the military fair for everybody. And when he's talking about women in combat,
he gets a lot of pushback there.
For sure. Critics say women have served honorably, effectively.
For decades.
Yeah. And judging someone's ability just because they're a woman.
It's discriminatory.
Exactly. It ignores the individual, their skills, what they bring to the table. And this whole woke military thing.
Some people think that's overblown.
Like, how much has political correctness really taken over?
Right. the military's main job is still
defending the country.
Yeah. And that Gideon analogy. Not everyone's on board with that either.
Some find it inspiring, but others
think a bit much.
A little heavy-handed. It's like comparing today to ancient Israel. Come on.
And mixing religion and politics, that can get for sure. So there are definitely other sides to consider. But even with those criticisms, I still think Hegseth's book,
it gets people talking.
It brings up these important questions about where the military's headed, the future of America, what we value.
What it means to be a patriot, to serve, what kind of society we want to be.
Heavy stuff. But whether you agree with Hegseth or not, got to give him credit. The guy's
passionate.
Oh, yeah. He cares deeply about the military and about America. And his book, it's a call to action. It's like he's saying, wake up, people. These freedoms we have,
they're not guaranteed.
It's up to us to protect what makes America special. So wrapping up our deep dive into the war on warriors, we've explored a lot. Hegseth's experiences, his arguments, the criticisms, even that whole Gideon thing. But we want to hear from you now. What stuck with you? What made you think? What parts did you agree with, disagree with? Head to the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, because these issues, they're important. And talking about them honestly and openly, that's how we figure out
the way forward.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Catch you next time.